State and federal governments, first driven by fear and then drunk on power, hurt and harm citizens with their manic COVID response.
Senator Babet comes from the outer reaches of some of the more kooky conspiracy theorist views. This is a pandemic of kookiness that has taken over the thinking of Liberals and Nationals.
This is just absolutely disgraceful what he is doing.
15 minutes of diatribe and vitriol from Senator Ayres there. It was one of the most disgusting speeches I've ever heard.
Mr Dutton needs to take seriously his responsibility as a political leader, and that is, you don't back the cranks.
It hasn't been one of the most attractive weeks in federal parliament.
Didn't pagan rituals sacrifice children to the tree and crocodile gods?
Order. It's not another opportunity. Order.
This week, this place has broken me. This place has broken me with its racism. This place has broken me with its attacks on Muslims, on Palestinian refugees, on disabled people, and on women.
The mob mentality is permitted by its leadership, and so my call is to Peter Dutton. He is the first to turn around in those situations and yell out and heckle. And the MPs under him, the coalition MPs, take their cue from his leadership.
Just because you're a Teal doesn't mean you can say what you want. I mean, just imagine if somebody came into your workplace and shouted at the top of their voice that somebody was a racist.
Which is all pretty ironic, given this week saw the government unveil legislation to lift parliamentary standards and create a better workplace for those who work in Parliament House.
It's all about improving workplace conduct in this building and making sure that where there is bad conduct or poor conduct, misconduct, that there's appropriate sanctions and enough deterrent to stop that behaviour from happening.
Brawls about an inquiry into COVID-19 in the Senate, crocodile gods, parliamentary insults, and trying to do something about parliamentary standards are hardly front and centre of most voters' minds. Any politician or poll can tell you that the issue on voters' minds are the cost of living and housing. So you might wonder why the federal opposition has asked not one single question about the cost of living during question time in the House of Representatives this week. Well, that's partly because it stops the government from talking about what it is doing about the cost of living.
I'm certainly speaking about the political expediency of those opposite. Yeah. Political expediency that isn't concerned about cost of living pressures, that's not concerned about jobs, that's not concerned about wages, that's not concerned about our economy, that's not concerned about social policy, that's not concerned about our environment or tackling climate change or any of the issues that Australians are talking about in their households, that is more concerned about the Middle East than Middle Australia.
It's been left to government backbenchers to ask Dorothy Dix questions on the issue, while the coalition has relentlessly pursued the question of visas for people fleeing Gaza.
It's now clear that by cutting corners, this government has put domestic political considerations ahead of national security, and Australians are now less safe. Will the Prime Minister apologise for breaking his promise before the election to keep Australians safe?
The fact is the border from Gaza had been closed for months and with no response or no issues raised by those opposite while people were actually coming in. They waited until people weren't coming in and the border was closed. The national security dimension of this is a beat-up. The checks these people go through are extensive, so to suggest there is a national security risk here is a complete beat-up.
The two houses of Parliament have also been engaged in long tussles over legislation. The government finishes the week having got the legislation through to appoint an administrator to the CFMEU. Today, the major parties found enough to agree on to pass reforms to the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
This bill passing the Parliament today because of a deal done between the Liberal and the Labor Party represents the greatest betrayal of disabled people and our families in the history of this country.
And the Future Made in Australia bills have gone through the House after many attempted amendments.
I really hope that there can be some common sense put into this, and I really hope that the Labor government, for Australia's sake, will go back and and maybe take on some of the ideas of the coalition. Let's work together at making sure that we can get it there.
The list of promised government reforms and legislation to get through Parliament remains long, despite this week's gains. The government today introduced bills to add superannuation to paid parental leave and family law reforms as part of a response to the domestic violence crisis. We are still waiting, though, for the government's aged care reforms, Reserve Bank reforms, electoral reforms and its housing funding package to either be introduced or dealt with by the Parliament. Much anticipated reforms, or bans, to gambling ads, which dominated the news at the beginning of this week, have disappeared, at least for now, without trace.